On the morning of June 7th, 2020, a crowd gathered at the base of a bronze statue in the centre of Bristol. The man it depicted had been standing there since 1895. His name was on schools and streets and concert halls across the city. Generations of Bristol children had grown up being told he was one of the greatest benefactors their city had ever produced. He had also served as a senior official of the Royal African Company during a 12-year period in which the company transported approximately 84,500 enslaved African men, women, and children across the Atlantic. Historians at the Bristol Radical History Group, working from the company's own records, have calculated that around 19,300 of those people died during the crossing. Their bodies were thrown into the sea. Within minutes, the statue was gone. Ropes went around its neck and its body. The bronze figure came away from its plinth, fell onto the pavement, and was dragged through the streets. It had overlooked for 125 years. At the harbour's edge, it was thrown into the water, the harbour that Bristol's slave-trading ships had left from for over a century. Bristol did not react to that moment with one voice. It never has. This is the story of a city whose wealth, architecture, and civic identity were profoundly shaped by one of history's most documented crimes, and which spent the next 3 centuries deciding what that meant. It is a story about a tidal river and the people who learned to use it, about explorers and slave traders and abolitionists and engineers, about riots and railways, and 4 minutes on a June afternoon that sent shockwaves across the English-speaking world. The plinth is still there. Bristol is still deciding. We are going back to where it started, to a gorge, a tidal river, and a settlement that wanted, more than anything, to trade. Chapter 1. The River Crossing. Picture a gorge, not a gentle valley. A deep, dramatic cut in the limestone. The kind of geological feature that makes you stop and look before you think about what it means practically. The River Avon, in what is now southwest England, runs through exactly this kind of landscape before it reaches the sea. The gorge at Clifton drops steeply from the cliff tops to the water below. The tides here are among the highest tidal ranges in the world. Twice a day, the river surges and then falls back, exposing mudflats that stretch for hundreds of meters before the water returns. This is not, on the surface, an obvious place to build a great city. And yet, from almost the first moment that human beings in Britain began thinking about trade in any organized way, people came to this gorge, because what looks like a problem is, if you understand it, an advantage. Here is what the tides do for a trading port. They give you a natural engine. A ship loaded with goods can ride the incoming tide upriver without needing wind or oar power to fight the current. It can unload, reload, and then ride the outgoing tide back to the sea. If you time your movements correctly, the river does the work for you. The earliest merchants who operated on the Avon understood this in the same instinctive way that every great port city in history has understood its geographic advantage. The river is not an obstacle. The river is the business. Archaeological evidence from the area around the Avon confluence, where the river meets the smaller River Frome at the site of the original Bristol settlement, confirms human activity going back thousands of years before any town existed there. Traders and travellers working the routes between Wales, Ireland, and southern England used this crossing repeatedly. The Romans built a road through the region, and the settlement at what is now the village of Sea Mills, a couple of miles downstream, served as a minor Roman port connecting to the wider Atlantic trade network. Roman coins, pottery fragments, and structural remains recovered from excavations at Sea Mills place it firmly within the commercial geography of Roman Britain. though it never grew into anything substantial. That is the important point about Bristol in its earliest centuries. The location was recognized, the potential was visible, but the settlement that would eventually become one of the most significant ports in the British Isles did not arrive fully formed. It grew slowly, through decisions made by people whose names we mostly do not know, in response to a world that was changing around them. The Anglo-Saxon period, roughly from the 5th century through the 11th, is when something that looks recognizably like a town begins to appear at the confluence of the Avon and the Frome. The name itself is Anglo-Saxon. Brixton, the place of the bridge, not a grand declaration of ambition, just a practical description of the most important physical fact about the settlement. There was a bridge here. That bridge meant you could cross the river without a boat, and that meant everyone moving between southern England and the coast of Wales, everyone carrying goods between these two regions, had to come through this place or travel a very long way around. Control the bridge, and you control the crossing. Control the crossing, and you control a percentage of everything that moves through it. By the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, Bristol was already substantial enough to appear in Domesday Book. The survey of English landholdings commissioned by William the Conqueror in 1086. The Domesday entry lists Bristol as a borough with significant taxable value. The town had a mint producing coins, which tells you something important. A mint means the Crown recognized this settlement as an economic centre worth incorporating into the monetary system. You do not put a mint in a village. But here is what the early records of Bristol also show. Something that gets passed over too quickly in civic histories that prefer to begin Bristol's story with merchants and wine. The Anglo-Saxon and early Norman town was already in the business of trading people, not yet on the scale that would come later, not yet across the Atlantic. But the trade from Bristol in the 11th and 12th centuries was real and documented. The chronicler William of Malmesbury, writing in the 12th century and drawing on earlier sources, described the practice explicitly. Men and women and children, many of them Irish, were bought and sold in Bristol's markets and shipped across the water. A bishop named Wulfstan, later recognized as a saint, made personal visits to Bristol specifically to preach against the trade and pressure the merchants to stop. According to his 12th century biographer Coleman, Wulfstan came repeatedly, standing in the market and preaching, until the practice finally declined. It declined. It did not disappear, and the mechanisms that had been built to conduct it, the harbour infrastructure, the commercial networks, the institutional willingness of Bristol's merchant class to move human beings as cargo when the profit justified it, did not disappear either. They went quiet for a few centuries. Then, when the economics changed and the opportunity presented itself at a scale that made the earlier trade look trivial, they came back. That is the first thing to understand about Bristol. This city did not stumble into the Atlantic slave trade by accident in the 17th century. It had a relationship with the commodification of human beings that stretched back to its earliest recorded history. The geography changed. The scale changed enormously. But the structural willingness of Bristol's commercial elite to treat human beings as transferable assets was not new. What grew alongside that feature, in the same centuries, was something equally important: a talent for organization, a capacity for risk, a merchant class that was better than almost any in England at identifying where the next profit would come from and finding the capital to chase it. Those qualities would take Bristol's merchants to Iceland for fish, to Gascony for wine, to Ireland for wool and cattle, and eventually they would drive the financing of a voyage that sent a Venetian navigator west across the Atlantic into waters no English expedition had yet systematically charted. That voyage would change everything, and Bristol paid for it. But before we get there, we need to understand what the town had become by the high medieval period. Because the Bristol that financed that voyage was not just a ford with a bridge and a market. It was a city of extraordinary commercial confidence, a place that had spent 3 centuries building the infrastructure and the civic identity that would eventually make it the second largest port in England. And that city had been built, stone by stone, on the tidal river that the people who named it Brixton understood better than anyone. The bridge was still the thing. Everything grew from the bridge. Chapter 2. A medieval port finds its reach. There is a document held today by the Bristol Record Office that dates from the year 1251. It is a royal charter, issued by King Henry III, granting the merchants of Bristol specific trading rights and formal legal protections. The Latin is dense and the parchment is old, but the meaning is clear. The Crown of England had decided that Bristol mattered enough to receive the kind of guarantees that only commercially significant places received. The king was acknowledging something that the merchants of Bristol had already known for some time. This was a city that could not be ignored. By the middle of the 13th century, Bristol had transformed itself from a well-positioned Anglo-Saxon crossing point into something considerably more significant. The process had taken roughly 200 years and involved a combination of geography, ambition, and the particular talent for commercial organization that would define Bristol's merchant class for the next 5 centuries. The Normans who arrived in England after 1066 were not interested in sentiment. They were interested in efficiency and control. They looked at Bristol's position, at the tidal river reaching toward the sea, at the town, sitting at the junction of trade routes connecting Wales, Ireland, and southern England, and they began to build. A castle went up almost immediately after the conquest, planted on a promontory, commanding the river and the town below it. Its stones have been traced in excavations beneath the modern city centre. That castle was not decorative. It was a statement of ownership. Bristol now belonged to the Norman order, and the Norman order intended to extract value from it. What they extracted was considerable. Trade with Ireland expanded rapidly under Norman administration. Bristol merchants had access to Irish cattle, wool, hides, and fish. In return, they shipped wine from Gascony, cloth from England, and manufactured goods in both directions across the Irish Sea. The crossing was short enough to be manageable and long enough to be profitable. Bristol became the primary English port for the Irish trade, a position it would hold for centuries. And that position generated wealth that was immediately reinvested in making the town more capable of generating more wealth. The harbour was improved. Quays were extended. Warehouses were built and rebuilt and extended again as the volume of goods passing through them grew. By the late 12th century, Bristol had been granted the status of a borough with substantial self-governing rights. This mattered enormously. A borough could elect its own officers, maintain its own courts, regulate its own markets, and collect certain revenues for its own use. Self-governance was the institutional foundation of commercial success. Merchants who could set their own rules, enforce their own contracts, and manage their own harbour operated with an efficiency that towns under tighter external control could not match. The merchant guilds that emerged in this period were not social clubs. They were commercial organisations with real power. They controlled who could trade in Bristol, under what conditions, at what prices, and with what guarantees. The men who ran those guilds learned to think about commercial advantage with a precision that would look entirely familiar to any modern business school graduate. They also learned to think at distance. The wine trade was the key that opened the wider world to Bristol. Gascony, the region of southwestern France centred on Bordeaux, was under English rule for much of the medieval period. and the wine it produced was consumed by the English aristocracy and emerging middle classes in enormous quantities. Bristol was ideally positioned to receive it. Ships loaded with wine at Bordeaux could catch favourable winds and currents for the crossing to Bristol. The return journey carried English wool and cloth. The financial logic was straightforward. The profits were substantial. But wine trade profits led to something more interesting than wine trade profits. They led to the development of a merchant class with capital to invest in new ventures, with ships capable of longer voyages, with navigational knowledge that extended steadily beyond familiar routes. Bristol merchants began probing further. Iceland and its extraordinary cod fisheries came into the Bristol commercial orbit by the mid-14th century. A voyage of real difficulty and genuine risk that the merchants of Bristol undertook because the returns justified the danger. The Iceland trade deserves more attention than it usually receives in histories of Bristol. The voyage required ships capable of surviving the North Atlantic. Navigators who understood waters that classical maps had described as the edge of the world. And a commercial organization back in Bristol, sophisticated enough to finance the expeditions, insure the risk, and market the dried fish on return. That the Bristol merchant community could do all of this by the 1300s tells you exactly what kind of commercial culture had developed in this city. And there was something else happening in those Iceland voyages that historians have connected, carefully and with increasing confidence, to what came next. The fishermen and merchants who worked the Iceland routes sailed waters that extended toward the northwest. They heard stories. They may have encountered people who had already been further west. The geographical imagination of Bristol's merchant class, by the second half of the 15th century, was oriented toward the Atlantic in a way that no other English merchant community quite matched. That orientation would eventually produce one of the most consequential voyages in the history of the world. But before we get to that voyage, one more aspect of medieval Bristol deserves attention that the city's official histories have sometimes treated too briefly. The prosperity that built the churches and merchant houses of medieval Bristol, the prosperity that funded the harbour improvements and the guild halls and the fine wool warehouses, was built in part on labour conditions that gave workers very little power to improve their circumstances. The workers who loaded and unloaded ships, who processed wool and cloth, who maintained the harbour infrastructure, operated under contracts and guild regulations that concentrated the benefits of commercial success heavily at the top. This is not a minor footnote. It is a pattern. The willingness to treat the labour of other human beings as a resource to be managed and extracted at minimum cost. The organisational capacity to enforce that arrangement through legal and institutional means. The ideological comfort with profound inequality presented as the natural order of things. These were characteristics of Bristol's commercial culture that developed across the medieval centuries. The city that was becoming the second largest port in England by the late 15th century was a genuinely impressive place. Its churches were extraordinary. Its merchant houses were substantial. Its harbour was busy with ships from France and Iceland and Ireland and Spain. The wealth was real, and it produced real beauty. It also produced a commercial class that had learned, over 3 centuries, to move goods across long distances at maximum profit, with minimum concern for anything that could not be converted into a ledger entry. That commercial class was about to meet the full Atlantic, and the Atlantic was about to change everything. Chapter 3. Cabot and the Edge of the Known World. In the spring of 1497, a ship called the Matthew left Bristol harbour and sailed west into waters no English expedition had yet systematically charted. The man who commanded it was not English. He was Venetian. Born Giovanni Cabot, known in England as John Cabot. He had been living in Bristol for several years by the time of the voyage, long enough to build the connections with the city's merchant community that made the expedition financially possible. The backing for the Matthew came from a consortium of Bristol merchants who saw in Cabot's proposal something they had been thinking about independently for some time: a western route toward Asia, or whatever lay to the west, that could give Bristol access to trade currently flowing through Lisbon and Seville to the benefit of the Portuguese and Spanish crowns. The commercial logic was clear. The risks were substantial. The Bristol merchants funded the voyage anyway. What Cabot found on June 24, 1497, was not Asia. It was land. Most historians, working from the available navigational records and contemporary accounts, believe it was the coast of Newfoundland or Cape Breton Island, though the precise landfall remains a subject of scholarly debate. What is not debated is the basic fact. An expedition financed by Bristol merchants and commanded by a Venetian navigator reached the North American continent on that date. Think carefully about what this means, particularly if you are watching this from the United States. The Bristol-financed Cabot voyage of 1497 became one of the primary foundations for later English claims in North America. The legal and political architecture of English colonialism in Virginia, in Plymouth, in every subsequent settlement that pushed westward across the continent, traced its territorial justification in significant part back to the letters patent that Henry VII issued to Cabot and his backers after the voyage returned. Without that Bristol-financed expedition, the English claim to North American territory would have had to be built on a different foundation entirely. Bristol helped establish the English foothold in the land that would eventually become the United States. Then, roughly a century and a half later, Bristol's merchants would begin using the same ocean to transport enslaved Africans to work the American plantations. The same ocean, the same commercial tradition, the same appetite for Atlantic profit applied to a different and infinitely more terrible cargo. Henry VII received Cabot's report with considerable interest and issued letters patent authorizing further expeditions. A second voyage departed in 1498. The records of that expedition are fragmentary and contested, and Cabot himself disappears from the historical record after it. His ultimate fate unknown. The English crown's sustained interest in North America went through periods of activity and neglect before the colonial projects of the 17th century gave it permanent institutional expression. But Bristol's connection to the Atlantic was permanently established by the Matthews voyage. The merchants who had funded Cabot were not dreamers. They were businessmen who had calculated the odds and decided the investment was worth making. When it produced a return, in the form of geographic knowledge and royal recognition, they did not lose interest. The Bristol merchant community of the late 15th and early 16th centuries was accumulating through the Iceland trade, the Cabot voyage, and the continuing expansion of European commercial horizons. Exactly the kind of Atlantic expertise that would become enormously valuable once the full extent of what lay to the west became clear. That expertise was organizational as much as navigational. The Bristol merchants knew how to finance long-distance voyages, how to manage risk across multiple investors, how to convert geographic knowledge into commercial advantage. These were not skills that could be improvised. They had been developed across 2 centuries of Atlantic trading and institutionalized in the guild and merchant networks of the city. By the early 16th century, Bristol was one of the most commercially sophisticated port cities in England, second in overall trade only to London, and, in some specific respects, more adventurous than the capital. The city's physical fabric reflected this. The churches were rebuilt and expanded. Merchant houses of real substance stood along the quayside, and the world those ships were sailing into was changing with a speed that even the most adventurous Bristol merchant of 1497 could not have fully anticipated. Spain and Portugal had divided the world, in the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, into 2 spheres of influence. The Caribbean islands that Columbus had reached were becoming plantation colonies. Sugar cultivation, which required enormous quantities of controlled labor, was expanding rapidly. The transatlantic demand for labor, and the decision by European colonial powers to meet that demand through the forced transportation of African people, was beginning to create the commercial structure that would, within less than 2 centuries, make Bristol fabulously wealthy and responsible for a catastrophe whose consequences are still being reckoned with today. The men who sat in Bristol's guild halls in the 1500s and read reports of Spanish and Portuguese profits in the Atlantic world were the commercial descendants of the men who had funded Cabot. They thought the same way. They calculated risk and return. They invested in advantage. The question was not whether Bristol would find a way into the Atlantic trade. The question was only one of time and opportunity. Both were coming. Chapter 4. The Triangle Forms. In the year 1654, a Bristol merchant named Thomas Colston, uncle to the man who would later become the city's most celebrated and most contested figure, made a commercial decision that his ledger books recorded in the same careful handwriting used for wine imports and wool exports. He invested in a slaving voyage. The entry looks like any other entry. A sum of money, a ship, a projected return, the transatlantic slave trade database, maintained by researchers at Rice University and drawing on decades of archival work across multiple countries, has reconstructed the basic commercial structure of these early Bristol slaving investments with considerable precision. What those ledger entries do not record, because ledger entries do not record such things, is what happened to the people those investments purchased. We will come to that. The Bristol slave trade did not begin fully formed. It assembled itself over several decades in the mid-17th century. Piece by piece, as Bristol merchants watched the profits flowing to London from the Royal African Company, the Crown-chartered monopoly that controlled English slave trading after 1672, and calculated what they could do if the monopoly were broken. The Royal African Company had the legal right to trade enslaved Africans from the West African coast to the English colonies in the Caribbean and North America. Bristol merchants were excluded from that trade by law. They were not excluded from understanding it. They could see the sugar prices. They could see the scale of Caribbean plantation expansion. They could see the returns on capital that the trade was generating for London investors. And they were not, as their history amply demonstrated, the kind of commercial community that accepted exclusion from profit without a fight. The campaign to break the Royal African Company monopoly was conducted through Parliament, through petitions, through the sustained application of commercial and political pressure by precisely the kind of organized merchant lobby that Bristol had been developing since the 12th century. It succeeded in 1698. From that year, all English merchants were legally free to trade enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Bristol moved with remarkable speed. The mechanics of the trade were, at their core, a system of 3 connected commercial transactions arranged across the Atlantic. A ship would leave Bristol loaded with manufactured goods, textile, metal tools, firearms, and alcohol that had established markets on the West African coast. Those goods would be traded in transactions conducted with African merchants and rulers who had their own commercial interests and their own power in these negotiations. For enslaved people, those enslaved people, men, women, and children taken from their communities through warfare, kidnapping, or debt bondage, would be transported across the Atlantic in what became known as the Middle Passage. On arrival in the Caribbean or the American colonies, the survivors would be sold to plantation owners. The ships would then reload with sugar, tobacco, or cotton and return to Bristol, where those goods would be sold in the English market. 3 legs, 3 transactions, 3 sets of profits, all of them dependent on the institution of slavery to function. The numbers that historians have extracted from the shipping records establish the scale of what Bristol did. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database records approximately 2,100 slaving voyages departing from Bristol between 1698 and 1807, the year the British slave trade was legally abolished. Historian David Richardson, whose 4-volume work Bristol, Africa, and the 18th century slave trade to America remains the definitive scholarly study of these records, has established that those voyages transported somewhere in the region of 500,000 enslaved people. Of those, historical analysis of the mortality data suggests that tens of thousands died during the Middle Passage itself, before the ships reached their destinations. Those numbers require a moment of stillness before we continue. Now consider what they mean in terms of individual human experience. The average Middle Passage voyage from the West African coast to the Caribbean took between 6 and 12 weeks, depending on winds, currents, and the specific route. Enslaved people were packed into the hold of the ship in conditions that contemporary witnesses, including some of the captains themselves, described in terms that make clear they understood the reality of what they were organizing. People were chained together in spaces where they could not stand, could barely turn. The heat was severe. Disease moved through those conditions with terrible efficiency. Dysentery, smallpox, and respiratory illness spread in ways that killed both the enslaved, with considerably less frequency, members of the crew. The testimony of Olaudah Equiano, an Igbo man from what is now Nigeria, who was enslaved as a child in the 1750s, and whose autobiography, published in 1789, is one of the most important primary sources for the experience of the Middle Passage, describes the interior of a slave ship in terms that remain almost impossible to read without physical revulsion. Equiano's account was read widely across England and had direct influence on the abolitionist movement. Bristol merchants were reading very different documents in the same years. They were reading their profit margins. Those margins were real and they were large. Historian Kenneth Morgan, in his study of Bristol's 18th century Atlantic commerce, has documented that successful slaving voyages generated returns substantially higher than most other forms of maritime trade of the period. Though mortality among the enslaved, fluctuating sugar prices, and the inherent risks of the Atlantic crossing made individual voyage outcomes highly variable. The aggregate returns across the full century of Bristol's slaving trade between 1698 and 1807 were sufficient to fundamentally restructure the city's economy. The organizational structure that made this possible was sophisticated. Slaving voyages were typically financed not by a single investor, but by a consortium of merchants who each took a share of the expected return and bore a proportionate share of the risk. This spread the financial exposure across multiple parties and made it possible to finance voyages that no single merchant could have funded alone. The same structure had been used in Bristol for the Iceland fishing trade and the Gascony wine trade. It was simply applied now to a considerably more profitable and considerably more terrible commodity. The ships themselves were built and maintained in Bristol. The provision of trade goods for the African coast created demand for Bristol's manufacturers. The return cargoes of sugar created demand for Bristol's refineries. The legal and financial services surrounding the trade employed Bristol's lawyers, bankers, and insurers. The slave trade was not a separate economic activity sitting alongside Bristol's regular commerce. It was woven through the fabric of the city's entire economic life. The sugar refineries that lined the Avon in the early 18th century were processing the product of enslaved labor. The merchants who drank coffee in Bristol's coffee houses were sweetening it with sugar from the same plantations. The warehouses, the counting houses, the elegant new streets and squares being built in the western districts of the city. All of it was connected. directly or through several commercial steps, to the wealth generated by enslaved African labor. Bristol, in 1698, was a prosperous merchant city. Bristol by 1740 was something qualitatively different. It was a city whose economic foundations had been fundamentally restructured by the profits of the slave trade. The wealth was an order of magnitude greater. The ambitions of its merchant class had expanded accordingly. The physical city was being rebuilt in ways that expressed that expanded confidence. And at the center of that transformation stood one man more than any other, a merchant who had been born into the trade, who had refined its organizational structures, who had personally directed the operations of a company that transported more enslaved people than almost any other institution in English history, and who had then used the profits of that work to make himself the great benefactor of the city he called home. His name was Edward Colston, and Bristol was about to build him a statue. Chapter 5. Edward Colston and the Golden Age. Edward Colston was born in Bristol in 1636. The son of a merchant family, with existing connections to trade in southern Europe and the early Atlantic commerce. He was educated in London, entered trade as a young man, and by his 30s had established himself in the commercial networks centered on the Royal African Company. He was not merely an investor, he was an executive. In March 1680, Colston purchased a share in the Royal African Company and became an active member of its management. He served on its major committees and rose through its leadership structure over the following years, holding the position of deputy governor in 1689 and 1690, before departing the company in 1692. This timeline, established through archival research published by the Bristol Radical History Group, drawing on the company's own records, matters because it establishes the precise nature of his involvement. He was not a passive shareholder watching from a distance. He was an operational manager during one of the company's most active periods. The records of the Royal African Company during the years of Colston's involvement, 1680 to 1692, tell us what that operational management produced. Historians working from the company's accounts and the transatlantic slave trade database have established that approximately 84,500 enslaved Africans were transported on Royal African Company ships during this period. Around 19,300 of those people died during the Middle Passage. Their bodies were disposed of in the ocean. Of the captives transported, approximately 12,000 were children aged 10 or younger. 1 in 4 of those children died en route. Colston did not personally sail on these ships. He sat in London offices and Bristol counting houses, managed the financial structures, reviewed the accounts, and recorded the profits. The distance between the executive suite and the hold of the ship was the distance between a man who considered himself a respectable Christian merchant and the reality of what his commercial decisions produced. That distance was not accidental. It was structural. The financial architecture of the slave trade was specifically designed to allow investors and executives to participate in the profits of a system whose physical reality they never had to witness. A modern financial analyst would recognize the structure immediately. The moral insulation was built into the business model. After departing the Royal African Company in 1692, Colston returned to Bristol, a wealthy man. What he did with that wealth is the source of the extraordinary complexity that surrounds his historical legacy. He gave enormous amounts of it away. Colston's School, founded in 1708, provided education to 100 poor boys of Bristol. He funded almshouses, providing housing for elderly residents. He contributed to the repair and maintenance of churches across the city. He made substantial gifts to hospitals. Later in life, as a Member of Parliament for Bristol from 1710 to 1713, he also advocated for the continuation of the slave trade, defending what he described as Bristol's commercial interests. And in his final years, he became a commissioner and investor in the South Seas Company, which transported an estimated 15,900 enslaved Africans between 1714 and 1720, with nearly 3,000 dying en route. The philanthropy was genuine. The schools and almshouses that Colston established provided real benefits to real people who would not otherwise have had them. The buildings his money repaired still stand. Now, sit with the arithmetic for a moment. The education given to 100 Bristol boys in 1708 was purchased, in the most direct financial sense, with the suffering and death of people whose names were not recorded on any Bristol street or school or commemorative plaque. The organisational labour of Colston's 12 years, managing the Royal African Company, the committee meetings, and the financial decisions and the mortality reports reviewed and filed, had produced returns that paid for the schools and the almshouses and the church restorations and left considerable wealth besides. This is not a retrospective moral judgment applied to a past that could not have known better. The abolitionists, who were already active in Bristol by the 1780s, knew very well what the slave trade was. Enslaved people whose testimonies began reaching English readers knew what it was. Some of Colston's contemporaries knew what it was. The argument that nobody at the time understood the moral weight of what was happening is not supported by the historical record. What is supported by the historical record is that the people with the power to end it chose, for many decades, not to. What makes Colston genuinely complicated, rather than simply villainous, is worth examining carefully. He operated entirely within the legal and commercial norms of his time. The Royal African Company was a Crown-chartered institution. The slave trade was legal, regulated, and celebrated as a driver of English commercial power. To participate in it was not to break society's rules. It was to succeed within them. The moral framework that would eventually produce abolition did not yet exist in its later form during the years of Colston's commercial career. The problem, and it is a real problem that Bristol spent 3 centuries refusing to fully address, is the question of what happens when a city builds its identity on a foundation that requires it to look at only half of the ledger. Bristol celebrated Colston's giving for 200 years, while declining to examine where the money came from with anything like the same seriousness. The schools bore his name. The concert hall bore his name. His statue occupied the centre of the city, and the people whose suffering generated the wealth behind all of it were, in the official civic memory of Bristol, essentially absent. This is not unusual in the history of cities built on colonial wealth. London did exactly the same thing. Liverpool did the same thing. Bristol's version was simply more concentrated, more visible, and ultimately more contested than most. The contest would not begin in earnest for a very long time. In the early 18th century, Bristol was not in the mood for moral inventory. It was in the mood for building. What that mood produced is still, in large part, what you see when you walk through the city today. And what it produced was genuinely beautiful. Chapter 6. Boom, City. Stand on the clifftop above the Avon Gorge on a clear morning and look at what surrounds you. To your left, the sweep of Clifton. Its Georgian terraces and crescents arranged along the ridge with a confidence that announces, without ambiguity, exactly what the people who built them thought they were worth. The Royal York Crescent, completed in 1820, stretches along the hillside in what is reputed to be the longest crescent in Europe. Its pale limestone facades catching the morning light in a way that the architects of the period understood and planned for deliberately. Below it, the streets of substantial townhouses built for merchants and their families who had accumulated enough capital to want their addresses to announce it. To your right, the gorge dropping away to the river below, And somewhere in this landscape, if you are standing there sometime between 1700 and 1800, there is no bridge crossing that gorge. What you see instead is the river far below, the tidal water moving with its extraordinary range, and the ships on it, the actual physical vessels that are the source of so much of what is being built behind you. Those ships are what you need to keep in your eye, because so much of this landscape, so much of what gives Georgian Bristol its beauty and its settled confidence, connects back to those ships and what they were carrying. Bristol, in the 18th century, experienced what economic historians describe as an accumulation event. Wealth generated by the Atlantic trade, and specifically by the slave trade and the plantation economy it supported, arrived in the city at a rate and volume that exceeded what the existing commercial infrastructure could absorb through normal investment. The merchants generating that wealth needed somewhere to put it. They put it into land, into buildings, into the physical transformation of the city around them. The result was a construction boom of remarkable scale and ambition that remade Bristol between roughly 1720 and 1820. And that produced the architectural fabric that defines the city's most celebrated neighborhoods today. Clifton was the most visible expression of this. The high ground, above the gorge, had been sparsely inhabited before the 18th century. Too steep and too far from the harbour to be commercially convenient. The wealth generated by the Atlantic trade changed that calculation. Merchants and their families who wanted to separate their domestic lives from the noise and smell of the commercial city below began building on the ridge. The fashion for fresh air and elevated prospects that characterized Georgian urban culture found in Clifton exactly the landscape it required. The architecture that resulted is genuinely extraordinary. The Royal Crescent, the Cornwallis Crescent, the streets of Clifton Village itself. These are buildings of real quality, designed by architects who understood proportion and material and the relationship between built form and landscape. They have lasted because they were built to last. They were also built with money that came, in whole or in substantial part, from the slave trade and the plantation economy it supported. The connection is not always direct and simple. Not every Georgian house in Clifton was funded by the specific profits of a specific slaving voyage. Wealth, generated by the slave trade, circulated through Bristol in ways that touched businesses and families, several steps removed from the trade itself. But the aggregate connection is not deniable, and the most careful historical scholarship does not attempt to deny it. The research of historian David Richardson, whose decades of work through the shipping records and merchant account books of the period produced the definitive study of Bristol's Atlantic trade, establishes that the slave trade was one of the primary drivers of Bristol's 18th century economic expansion. The buildings that expansion produced are still standing. The wealth expressed itself in ways beyond architecture. Bristol, in the early 18th century, developed the social infrastructure of a confident commercial city. Coffee houses multiplied, perhaps a dozen or more operating in the central city by the 1730s, each serving as an informal commercial exchange where merchants discussed prices, negotiated deals, and gathered intelligence about ship movements and market conditions. The coffee they drank was sweetened with sugar from Caribbean plantations. The rum that flowed in the evenings came from the same source. The Theatre Royal, which opened in 1766 and still operates today as one of the oldest working theatres in the English-speaking world, was built by subscription among Bristol's commercial elite. The subscribers whose names appear on the founding documents include men from families whose wealth traced directly to the slave trade. The building stands in King Street, a short walk from the harbour, and its Georgian interior is precisely what a prosperous commercial city looked like when it decided to give itself a cultural institution worthy of its ambitions. Meanwhile, on the quayside and in the counting houses, The mechanics of the slave trade continued to operate, with the same methodical efficiency that had always characterized Bristol's commercial culture. The ships that made all of this possible were getting larger. The technical demands of the Atlantic trade drove investment in ship design and construction that made Bristol's shipbuilding industry one of the most capable in England. The insurance market that developed alongside the shipping industry was similarly sophisticated. Bristol had its own networks of underwriters who specialized in the particular risks of Atlantic voyages. Insuring a slaving voyage was a specific commercial transaction with its own financial logic. The Bristol underwriters who worked through those calculations were, in the most literal sense, putting a financial value on the survival or death of human beings held in the holds of ships on the Atlantic. That financial architecture made the slave trade more economically efficient. It spread the risk across more investors, making it accessible to a wider pool of capital. It normalized the treatment of human lives as financial instruments in ways whose implications extended far beyond the trade itself. By the 1740s, Bristol was at the height of its commercial power. Its position as the second largest port in England was uncontested. Its merchant community was wealthy, organized, and politically connected. The city felt, to the people who lived at the top of its social hierarchy, like a place whose prosperity was permanent and whose future was unlimited. They were wrong about the permanence. They were wrong about the model, but they did not know that yet. What they did not see, or chose not to see, was that the foundations of their golden age were already being examined by people who would eventually tear them apart. The abolitionists were coming, and some of them were already in Bristol. Chapter 7. The Abolitionists Fight Back. On the 22nd of May, 1787, a small group of men gathered at a printing shop on George Street in London and founded the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. Among its 12 founding members were 9 Quakers and 3 Anglicans, including a young man named Thomas Clarkson, who had written a prize-winning essay at Cambridge on whether it was lawful to enslave other people without their consent, and had, in the course of researching that essay, become incapable of thinking about anything else. Clarkson spent the following months and years travelling to the port cities of England, collecting evidence. He arrived in Bristol in June of that same year, 1787, and what he found there he described in his memoir, published in 1808, with a clarity that remains striking today. He gathered testimony from sailors who had served on slaving ships. He collected instruments used in the trade, leg irons and restraining devices, and carried them to display to audiences who had, in most cases, never seen such objects before. He found a sympathetic guide in the landlord of a public house near the docks called the 7 Stars, who helped him make contact with sailors willing to speak. He met ship surgeons, including Alexander Falconbridge, who had sailed on 4 slaving voyages and was willing to testify publicly about the conditions he had witnessed. Falconbridge would go on to act as Clarkson's personal bodyguard during his time in the city. The threats were real enough to require one. His Bristol work produced evidence that fed directly into the parliamentary campaign against the slave trade. But it also produced enemies. The Bristol merchant community understood exactly what Clarkson was doing. He received threats. He was followed. In his memoir, he described being approached by a group of men on the quayside who he believed intended to push him into the harbour. He escaped by moving quickly and keeping a crowd between himself and them. The merchants who felt threatened by Clarkson's investigation were not wrong to feel threatened. He was building the case that would destroy their business model. The abolitionist movement in Bristol had its own powerful local dimension. Hannah More was born in Stapleton, just outside Bristol. In 1745, she became one of the most widely read writers in England, her religious and educational works selling in numbers that rivaled her better-remembered contemporaries. She was also, by the 1780s, a committed abolitionist, writing poetry and essays against the slave trade that circulated widely among the middle-class English readership, whose opinions mattered most to Parliament. Her poem, Slavery, published in 1788 and timed to coincide with the parliamentary debate on abolition, was read and discussed across England. She had grown up in a city whose prosperity was built on the trade she was condemning. She understood the local stakes precisely. She wrote anyway. The Quaker community in Bristol, present in the city since the 17th century, and always maintaining a skeptical distance from the values of the commercial establishment, was deeply engaged in the abolitionist cause. Bristol Quakers signed petitions, funded pamphlets, and provided organizational infrastructure for local anti-slavery activity in ways that the formal history of the movement sometimes underweights, because Quaker activism tended to be quiet and institutional rather than dramatic. And the petitions themselves tell a revealing story about Bristol public opinion. In 1788, Parliament received petitions from across England calling for abolition of the slave trade. Bristol sent a petition with several thousand signatures supporting abolition. It also sent a counter-petition, signed by merchants and commercial interests, opposing it. The city was, quite literally, arguing with itself in the same parliamentary session. The same streets, the same coffee houses, the same civic institutions contained people who held violently opposed views on whether the trade that had built Bristol's golden age should be allowed to continue. William Wilberforce, the Yorkshire Member of Parliament, who became the parliamentary face of the abolitionist campaign, had extensive connections with the Bristol evangelical community and visited the city on multiple occasions, preaching and building the political support the campaign required. His connection to Bristol was not incidental. This was one of the places where the argument about slavery was being conducted with the greatest intensity, precisely because the local economic stakes were so high. The campaign took 20 years. It required a sustained parliamentary effort of a kind that had rarely been seen in English political history. Repeated introductions of abolition bills, repeated defeats by the combined lobbying power of the West India interest, whose wealth depended on the continuation of the trade, and repeated regroupings by the abolitionist network. The arguments made against abolition by Bristol's merchant community were not all cynical. Some reflected genuine economic anxiety. The slave trade had become so embedded in Bristol's commercial structure that its removal threatened a cascade of consequences that were genuinely difficult to predict. Warehouses and ships and insurance networks and refinery capacity had all been built around the assumption of continuing Atlantic trade. But the arguments made by the abolitionists were stronger, and they had the moral weight that comes from being correct about something that matters enormously. On March 25, 1807, the Slave Trade Act received royal assent. From that date, it was illegal for British ships to transport enslaved people. The trade that had made Bristol wealthy, that had funded the schools and the churches and the crescents and the concert halls, was over. Except that it was not quite over. The Slave Trade Act abolished the trading of enslaved people by British ships. It did not abolish slavery itself. Enslaved people already in the Caribbean colonies remained enslaved. The plantation system continued to operate. The profits from plantation agriculture, generated by the labor of people who were still legally property, continued to flow back to Bristol and London and Liverpool. Full emancipation came with the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which came into force on August 1st, 1834. On that date, approximately 800,000 enslaved people in the British Caribbean were legally freed. The compensation paid under the Act, totaling £20 million, which represented approximately 40% of the annual national government budget at the time, according to research by University College London, went not to the freed people, but to the slave owners, Bristol merchants and families with West Indian plantation interests received compensation payments traceable in the historical records. Those payments were invested in ways that continued to generate returns for those families for generations. Some of that money went into the railways that were about to transform Bristol. Some went into the new industries of the Victorian era. The wealth of slavery did not end with emancipation. It transformed. The people who had been freed received nothing. No land, no capital, no compensation for the decades or centuries of unpaid labor from which other people had profited. They were free, in the legal sense, without the economic foundation that freedom requires to mean something in practice. Bristol celebrated abolition. The names of Wilberforce and Clarkson and Hannah More were honored. The slave trade was treated as a regrettable episode that had been, through moral courage, brought to an end. The people who had actually been enslaved, and what might be owed to them and their descendants, were largely absent from that narrative. They would not remain absent forever, but it would take another 150 years before that absence became impossible for the city to sustain. In the meantime, Bristol needed a new story. The slave trade was gone. The golden age it had funded was becoming a chapter rather than a present. The city turned toward a technology that was remaking the entire world, and toward one extraordinary man whose ambition matched the scale of what needed to be rebuilt. Chapter 8. Brunel's Bristol. There is a bridge that everyone who visits Bristol eventually stands on. It crosses the Avon Gorge at 248 feet above the river at high tide. Its two towers rising from the cliff tops on either side. Its chains carrying a roadway that stretches 702 feet from bank to bank. On a clear day, with the gorge falling away beneath you and the Avon moving far below and the Somerset countryside stretching out to the west, it produces the particular combination of awe and vertigo that only a handful of structures in the world reliably deliver. The man who designed it won the competition in 1831 at the age of 24. After 2 rounds of submissions in which Thomas Telford, the Scottish engineer brought in to assess the entries, rejected all the original proposals, including Brunel's first version, submitted his own counter-design, and watched the Bristol Committee reject that in turn. Brunel's revised proposal prevailed in the second round. He did not live to see it built. Isambard Kingdom Brunel died in 1859, 5 years before the bridge opened, completed by engineers John Hawkshaw and William Henry Barlow, using his original drawings as their foundation. The chains that hold the bridge up today did not come from a new foundry. They came from London. Brunel had designed another suspension bridge over the Thames in the 1840s, the Hungerford Bridge, a pedestrian crossing that opened in 1845. When that bridge was demolished in 1860 to make way for the Charing Cross Railway Bridge, the chains were purchased and carried to Bristol by rail on the Great Western Line. 2/3 of the links in the Clifton Suspension Bridge today are the original wrought iron from Brunel's own demolished Thames crossing. The bridge that completed his legacy was built, in part, from the recycled remains of an earlier one. That detail matters beyond the merely interesting. Bristol had a habit of recycling the past into the present without always fully acknowledging where the material came from. The bridge above the gorge did it literally. The city below it did it in ways that were considerably more consequential. Brunel was born in Portsmouth in 1806, the son of a French engineer named Marc Isambard Brunel, who had fled the Revolution and built a career in England. The father was talented. The son was something that comes along perhaps once or twice in a century. An engineer with the spatial imagination of an architect, the commercial instincts of a merchant, and a physical appetite for risk that led him to personally enter the tunnels and shafts of his own projects when they were in danger of collapsing, to direct operations from the inside of structures that were in the most literal sense, threatening to kill him. He came to Bristol at 23, won the bridge competition, then watched the funding dry up in the economic difficulties of the early 1830s and moved on to other projects, while the bridge towers stood incomplete above the gorge for decades. The other projects were not small. The Great Western Railway, which Brunel was appointed chief engineer of in 1833 at the age of 26, was the most ambitious railway construction project in England at the time of its conception. The route ran from London to Bristol, approximately 118 miles, and Brunel designed every aspect of it, not just the tracks and the earthworks and the bridges and the tunnels, but the stations and the rolling stock and the gauge of the track itself. That last decision produced one of the great engineering controversies of the 19th century. Standard gauge, 4 feet 8.5 inches between the rails, had been established as the norm for English railways. Brunel rejected it. He chose a broad gauge of 7 feet and a quarter inch, arguing that the wider gauge allowed for lower, more stable carriages, higher speeds, and a smoother ride. He was right about the engineering. He was wrong about the economics. The break of gauge problem, wherever the Great Western connected with other railways, eventually became commercially unsustainable. The Great Western converted to standard gauge in the 1880s, decades after his death. But before that conversion, the Great Western Railway transformed the relationship between Bristol and London permanently. The journey from Bristol to London had taken a full day by coach, under good conditions. From the opening of the full line on June 30th, 1841, it took approximately 2 hours. The shrinkage of distance that the railway produced was not merely a convenience. It restructured the entire economic geography of southern England. Bristol Temple Meads Station, designed by Brunel and completed in 1840, still stands alongside the expanded Victorian station that replaced it as the main operational facility. The original building is one of the earliest surviving railway terminus buildings in the world. Its mock Tudor facade and its great hammer beam roof, which Brunel specified with a span wider than Westminster Hall, sat at the edge of a city being remade by the technology it housed. In April 1838, the steamship Great Western, built in Bristol to Brunel's design, arrived in New York after a 15-day crossing from Bristol. She was a wooden paddle-wheel vessel, the largest passenger ship in the world at the time of her launching, and her successful crossing established that a purpose-built steamship could make the Atlantic voyage reliably and commercially. It was proof of concept. But Brunel was already thinking beyond it, because 4 years later, in 1843, a second Bristol-built ship achieved something that made the Great Western look like a prototype. The steamship Great Britain, launched on July 19th of that year, was the first ocean-going ship in history to combine an iron hull with screw propulsion. These were not incremental improvements on what the Great Western had done. They were a different idea about what a ship was, where the Great Western was wood and paddle wheels, traditional materials, and traditional propulsion made larger. The Great Britain was iron and a screw propeller. A technological leap that set the design standard for ocean-going ships for the rest of the 19th century and beyond. When she entered the water, she was the largest ship ever built, more than 100 feet longer than her nearest rival. She is still in Bristol. The dry dock in the Great Western Dockyard where she was built is now a museum ship. Her iron hull restored and preserved under a glass sea that protects the metal from further deterioration. If you stand beside her and look up at the scale of the hull from the bottom of that dry dock, you understand in a physical way that no photograph quite conveys what it meant to build this object in 1843. The riveted iron plates rising above you, the sheer size of the thing. This was not a refinement of existing practice. It was a statement about what the future looked like. made in iron, in Bristol, by a man who was 37 years old and had already built a railway and a suspension bridge. Brunel was giving Bristol a new identity that the city needed urgently. The slave trade had been abolished. The golden age built on its profits was becoming history. The railways and the steamships and the extraordinary bridge above the gorge gave it a new story to tell about itself. The story was true. The engineering was real. The achievement was genuine. But here is what that new story sat on top of. The Bristol that Brunel was helping to modernize was not at the level where most of its inhabitants actually lived. The elegant terraces of Clifton or the drawing rooms of the merchant class. It was a city of profound and worsening inequality. Workers, arriving from the surrounding counties and from Wales, found housing in districts whose conditions the reformers of the period documented with increasing alarm. The harbour-side neighbourhoods were densely overcrowded. Sanitation was inadequate. Cholera, which struck Bristol in 1832 and again in 1849, killed people in the overcrowded working-class districts at rates that the residents of Clifton did not experience. The men who built the Great Western Railway and the steamship Great Britain worked for wages that kept them in those conditions. The gap between Brunel's engineering ambition and the living conditions of the workers who realized it was one of the defining features of Victorian Bristol, as it was of every Victorian industrial city. And the wealth generated by the slave trade had not disappeared with abolition. It had been invested, inherited, and transformed. Some had gone into the railway investments of the 1830s and 40s. Some had gone into the compensation payments to slave owners that Parliament authorised in 1833. Some had become the endowments of schools and hospitals whose names still honoured the men who established them. The bridge above the gorge was finished in 1864, with chains recycled from a demolished London crossing. Bristol had done something similar with its history. It had taken the profits of one era, recycled them into the identity of the next, and presented the resulting Victorian respectability as though the earlier foundation no longer required examination. The buildings were real. The engineering was extraordinary. The respectability was, in certain important respect, constructed on ground that had not yet been honestly surveyed. Chapter 9. The Two Wars and the Weight of Empire. On the morning of September 25th, 1940, German bombers appeared in the skies north of Bristol. Radar stations on the south coast had tracked the formation as it crossed the Dorset coast. But the flight path suggested the bombers were heading for Yeovil, not Bristol. By the time the actual target became clear, the aircraft were already over their destination. Their target was Filton. The Bristol Aeroplane Company had been building military aircraft there since the beginning of the war, producing Blenheim bombers and the newly introduced Beaufighter fighters that were flying missions over occupied Europe. The factory workers who arrived at their stations that morning were building the planes that were fighting the Battle of Britain. They did not know they were also the target. 68 Heinkel bombers, escorted by a fighter screen of Messerschmitt aircraft, arrived over Filton just before midday and released their load in a bombing run that lasted 45 seconds. 168 bombs struck the site. 6 air raid shelters took direct hits. 91 Bristol Aeroplane Company workers were among the 132 people killed in that single raid. Over 300 more were injured. 8 aircraft under construction were destroyed. Production halted for several months. For an American audience, the connection is direct. The Beaufighter aircraft built at Filton flew alongside American aircraft over occupied Europe. The workers who built those planes on the same factory floors that the bombs hit were doing the same work, toward the same end, as the factory workers in Detroit and Chicago who were building aircraft for the Allied effort. What happened at Filton that September morning was not a distant European story. It was part of the same war, fought from the same side. The Filton Raid was not the beginning and not the end. Between June 1940 and May 1944, Bristol endured over 80 air raids. The sustained campaign that Bristol people came to call the Bristol Blitz included a particularly intensive attack on the night of November 24, 1940, when bombs fell on the city centre, on the harbour, and on the residential streets surrounding both, the Church of St. Peter and St. Paul, which had stood since the medieval period, was gutted. The Dutch House, a timber-framed merchant building from the 1500s that had survived the English Civil War and 3 centuries of urban development, burned to the ground. Approximately 1,300 civilians were killed across the full 4 years of the bombing campaign. According to records held by the Bristol Record Office and Bristol Museums, Bristol was among the most heavily bombed English cities outside London, a distinction earned through geography, since its harbour and its aircraft manufacturing made it a legitimate military target, and through 4 years of endurance. But to understand Bristol fully in this period, we need to go back a generation, because the First World War had already changed the city in ways whose consequences were still working themselves out when the Second War arrived. Between 1914 and 1918, Bristol sent tens of thousands of men to the Western Front, to Gallipoli, to Mesopotamia, and to campaigns in Africa where British and German colonial forces fought over territory whose populations had no voice in the conflict. The memorials that went up after 1918, in parks and churches and civic spaces across the city, recorded names from every part of Bristol's social geography. Those memorials did not record the contributions of people from Bristol's communities of colour, or the colonial subjects from across the British Empire, whose labour and military service had sustained the war effort without receiving equivalent civic recognition. Between the 2 wars, Bristol was rebuilding and reshaping itself. The tobacco company W.D. and H.O. Wills, which had become one of the largest employers in the city by the early 20th century, drew its raw material from Virginia and other American tobacco regions, whose agricultural history was inseparable from the slave labour that had established and expanded them. The Wills family had become one of Bristol's great philanthropic dynasties, funding the University of Bristol, which opened in 1909, in significant part through tobacco wealth. The university's founding benefaction from the Wills family was, at the time, the largest single donation to a British university. The chain of economic inheritance connecting Bristol's institutional landscape to earlier histories of coerced labour was longer and more complex than a simple line. But it was unbroken. Meanwhile, Edward Colston's statue still stood. Through the First World War and the 1920s and 30s, the bronze figure continued to occupy its plinth in the centre of the city. Colston Hall, the city's main concert venue, had opened in 1867, named after the merchant whose philanthropy the Victorian city had chosen to celebrate. The name was embedded in the institutional fabric in ways that would require determined and sustained effort to remove. The Second World War ended in Europe in May 1945. Britain emerged financially drained and in possession of an empire whose days were clearly numbered. India would be independent within 2 years. The African colonies were moving, at different speeds and through different processes, toward independence. The Caribbean territories, whose plantation economies had built Bristol's 18th century wealth, were watching the process and drawing their own conclusions. Before the empire fully dissolved, it sent people. The British Nationality Act of 1948 gave citizens of British colonies and Commonwealth countries the right to live and work in the United Kingdom. The labour shortages of post-war reconstruction created practical demand for workers that the domestic population could not fully supply. Workers from Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, and the other islands responded. They came to a city that had sent ships to West Africa for nearly a century and a half, that had been a primary node in one of the largest forced migrations in human history. And they came to a city that did not, in most respects, make them welcome. The Caribbean migrants who arrived in Bristol in the late 1940s and the 1950s encountered a housing market that routinely refused them, a labour market with significant sectors that excluded them, and a social culture that treated their presence as an intrusion rather than a continuation of a connection between Bristol and the Caribbean that was, in historical terms, very old indeed. They settled, in large numbers, in the neighbourhood of St Paul's, an inner-city district to the northeast of the city centre, whose Victorian housing stock was affordable precisely because it had not been well maintained. St Paul's became a Caribbean neighbourhood in the way that immigrant communities in cities always create their own cultural spaces when the surrounding city refuses to fully absorb them. Churches, businesses, social clubs, informal networks of mutual support. The tensions that resulted from the collision between that community and the city around it were not going to resolve themselves quietly. They were going to begin with a bus. Chapter 10. Windrush, Race, and the Other Bristol. In the spring of 1963, a youth worker and civil rights activist named Paul Stevenson approached the West Indian Development Council in Bristol with a plan. He had identified a specific and provable instance of racial discrimination by the Bristol Omnibus Company, which operated the city's public bus network. The company had an unwritten policy, maintained through informal practice rather than any official document, of refusing to employ black or Asian workers as bus drivers or conductors. Stevenson intended to expose that policy publicly and force the company to end it. The method he chose drew directly on the Montgomery bus boycott in Alabama, in which the black community had refused to ride the city buses from December 1955 until the segregation policy was overturned in December 1956. Bristol in 1963 was not Montgomery in 1955. There were no formal segregation laws in Britain. The discrimination was informal, customary, maintained through private company policy. But the effect, for the people subjected to it, was discrimination as real and as humiliating as anything enforced by statute. Stevenson's approach was precise. He arranged for a young Jamaican man named Guy Bailey, who was looking for work and met all the stated requirements for the conductor position, to apply for a job with the Bristol Omnibus Company. The company's manager, when he realized during the process that Bailey was black, cancelled the application. The discrimination was now on the record, witnessed, and documented. The boycott that Stevenson and his colleagues organized in response, alongside Roy Hackett, Owen Henry, Audley Evans, and Prince Brown, began on April 30th, 1963. The West Indian community of Bristol, numbering around 7,000 people at the time, stopped riding the buses. Local trade unions, whose record on the issue was complicated and not uniformly admirable, were pressured to take positions. The national press picked up the story. Tony Benn, then the Member of Parliament for Bristol South East, supported the boycott publicly. Harold Wilson, the leader of the Labour Party, expressed support. On August 28, 1963, the Bristol Omnibus Company announced it was ending its colour bar. The same day, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his speech at the March on Washington. The timing was coincidental in the most literal sense. The two events had no direct organisational connection. But history occasionally produces coincidences that make a point with unusual clarity. The Bristol bus boycott preceded the Race Relations Act of 1965, the first British legislation to make racial discrimination in public places illegal. by 2 years. Paul Stevenson gave evidence to the parliamentary committee examining the bill. The boycott that started on a street in Bristol contributed to changing the law of the land. This is a piece of British civil rights history that receives far less attention than it deserves, particularly given how familiar the American civil rights movement of the same period is to English-speaking audiences worldwide. The reasons for that imbalance are worth examining. Part of it is scale. Part of it is the difference between formal legal segregation and informal discriminatory practice. The moral drama of formal apartheid is easier to narrate than the more diffuse drama of institutional racism that nobody will put in writing. And part of it, less comfortably, may be that acknowledging the Bristol bus boycott requires acknowledging that Britain in 1963 had a race problem, that its national self-image as a place of tolerance found deeply inconvenient to admit. The Caribbean community of St. Paul's had won something real with the boycott. But winning one battle against institutional discrimination did not resolve the broader conditions under which they lived. The housing market in Bristol remained deeply inhospitable to black residents through the 1960s and into the 70s. The schools serving those neighbourhoods were underfunded relative to schools in more prosperous parts of the city. The police relationship with the St. Paul's community was characterised by a level of stop-and-search activity that generated sustained and well-documented resentment. These conditions accumulated through the economic deterioration of the late 1970s, when manufacturing job losses fell hardest on communities that had been directed into industrial employment and now found those jobs disappearing. On the afternoon of April 2nd, 1980, police officers entered the Black and White Cafe on Grosvenor Road in St. Paul's as part of a licensing raid. What happened next is disputed in its precise details, but clear in its general outline. People in and around the cafe resisted. Word spread through the neighbourhood with striking speed. A crowd gathered. Police vehicles were overturned and burned. For several hours, the police lost control of a significant portion of the St. Paul's neighbourhood. The disturbance lasted just under 7 hours. 19 police officers were wounded. 130 people were arrested. The St. Paul's Uprising of 1980 was the first major urban disturbance of its kind in post-war Britain. It came a year before the Brixton and Toxteth events that drew more national attention, partly because they were larger and partly because they happened in cities whose difficulties were easier to frame as nationally representative. St. Paul's came first, and it came first because the conditions that produced it had been building. In that specific neighbourhood, in that specific city, for longer. But something else was happening in St. Paul's through all of this that the narrative of crisis sometimes overshadows. The Caribbean community that had been building its life in that neighbourhood since the 1950s had created something of genuine cultural vitality. The St. Paul's Carnival, which began in 1968 as a small street celebration and grew over the following decades into one of the largest Caribbean-style carnivals in Britain outside London, was an expression of cultural confidence built and maintained through difficult decades. The music, the food, the visual culture of the Caribbean community in Bristol had, by the 1970s and 80s, begun to influence the city around it in ways that moved outward from St. Paul's into the broader culture. Bristol, in the 1980s, was producing music that would eventually reach a global audience. The trip-hop sound that emerged from the city in the early 1990s, associated with artists including Massive Attack, Portishead, and Tricky, drew directly on the Caribbean musical culture of St. Paul's, on the reggae sound systems and the culture of musical experimentation that had developed in that neighbourhood. Wild Bunch, the collective that preceded Massive Attack, was rooted in St. Paul's in ways that the music they eventually made would carry into the world. The city that had trafficked Africans across the Atlantic in the 17th and 18th centuries was now exporting to global audiences. Music that was in substantial part the cultural descendant of those Africans and their Caribbean-born descendants. That trajectory is not a redemption narrative. It is a more complicated story about what survives, what transforms, and what history produces when it is left to work through human communities over long enough timescales. Meanwhile, in the city centre, on his plinth on Colston Avenue, Edward Colston continued to stand. He had been standing there for 90 years by the time of the St. Paul's uprising. The conversation about what he represented had not yet begun in any organised public way. That conversation was coming, but it would take another 40 years to reach its conclusion. Chapter 11. The Long Argument. The first serious public challenge to the Colston statue did not come in 2020. It came in 1998. That year, a local historian named Madge Dresser published research drawing on the work of scholars, including David Richardson, that laid out, in documented and accessible terms, the full extent of Edward Colston's involvement in the slave trade. The research was not new to academic specialists. It was new to the broader Bristol public, for whom Colston had remained primarily the philanthropist whose name was on their schools and concert halls, rather than the slave trade executive whose company had transported tens of thousands of people across the Atlantic. The publication generated local discussion. Community organisations, particularly those representing Bristol's black community, began raising questions about the appropriateness of the civic honours the city continued to bestow on Colston's memory. The questions were reasonable, documented, and addressed to civic institutions with the power to act on them. The civic institutions did not act. What followed over the next 22 years was one of the most protracted and instructive examples of institutional failure to address a clear and documented problem in recent British civic history. The record of what was proposed, who blocked it, and on whose behalf tells a story about power in a British city that goes well beyond one statue. The merchant venturers were central to that story. The Society of Merchant Venturers traces its formal existence to a royal charter of 1552. It describes itself today as a charitable organisation focused on education and community benefit. It administers significant assets and has maintained, across its long history, close relationships with Bristol's commercial and political elite, and it had, through most of the period of the Colston controversy, a direct institutional interest in the continued commemoration of Edward Colston, who had been one of its most prominent historical members and whose philanthropy was connected to several institutions the venturers still administered. In the early 2000s, a proposal was developed to add an explanatory plaque to the statue, acknowledging Colston's role in the slave trade alongside his philanthropic activities. The idea was not to remove the statue. It was to contextualize it, to ensure that people standing in front of the bronze figure had access to the full historical record. The proposal was debated by Bristol City Council and agreed in principle. A draft text was produced. Negotiations over the exact wording began. Those negotiations continued for years. Here is the kind of moment those negotiations produced. In 2003, after the official plaque process had already stalled once, members of a local arts collective called Set in Stone took a different approach. Unable to achieve the official contextualization that negotiations had failed to produce, they attached an unofficial plaque to the statue's base in the middle of the night. It listed the dates and some of the documented consequences of Colston's involvement with the Royal African Company in plain English. It did not editorialize. It stated facts. The plaque was removed by the City Council within days. The council cited proper procedures, the photographs of the unofficial plaque, and the story of why it had been put there and immediately removed, circulated widely. For many people in Bristol's black community, the speed with which the city moved to remove a factual statement from the base of the statue, after years of failing to act on the official plaque proposal, said more about institutional priorities than any official communication could have done. The official process repeated itself in different forms, multiple times across the following 15 years. In 2017, a revised proposal for a new plaque with updated wording was agreed by the council and then blocked again when disagreements over specific language made consensus impossible. By this point, the argument had been running publicly for nearly 2 decades, and the statue remained unchanged. The concert hall was a separate argument running in parallel. Colston Hall had carried its name since 1867. As the controversy intensified, Bristol's arts community began raising questions about whether the name was appropriate for a public cultural institution. The management acknowledged the controversy and began a formal review. The decision to rename the hall was announced in 2017. The actual renaming, to Bristol Beacon, did not take effect until 2022, 5 years between announcement and implementation, for a name change on a building. What the 22-year record of failed negotiation demonstrates is that the institutions with the power to change the way Bristol publicly commemorated Edward Colston consistently chose not to exercise that power. The arguments they used in defense of that choice evolved over time. The substance beneath those evolving arguments remained consistent. The people with institutional power in Bristol preferred to leave the situation as it was. The community organisations representing Bristol's black residents, the academics who had documented the slave trade, the journalists who had covered the controversy for 2 decades, the artists and activists who had raised the issue in public forums across 22 years, had used every legitimate institutional channel available to them. They had made the arguments. They had produced the evidence. They had negotiated in good faith across multiple rounds of discussions that ended in the same place. Nothing had changed. By the beginning of 2020, the situation was as follows. The statue had stood unchanged for 125 years. 22 years of negotiations had produced no plaque. The concert hall was in the process of being renamed on a timeline that would not produce an actual name change for another 2 years. The institutional establishment had, through a combination of active resistance and procedural delay, successfully prevented any substantial change to the way Bristol publicly commemorated Edward Colston. Then, on May 25, 2020, a police officer in Minneapolis knelt on the neck of a black man named George Floyd for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. George Floyd died. A bystander's phone captured the killing on video. The video was shared globally within hours. What happened next? In Minneapolis, and then across the United States, and then in cities across the world, was a mobilization of public anger at racial injustice on a scale that had not been seen in decades. In Bristol, people began making plans. Chapter 12. 4 minutes in June. Sunday, June 7th. 2020 was a warm day in Bristol. A Black Lives Matter demonstration had been organised for that afternoon. One of hundreds taking place across Britain and Europe in the days following George Floyd's death. The organisers had publicised it through social media. The crowd that gathered in the centre of Bristol numbered, by most estimates, between 7,000 and 10,000 people. The official route did not pass Colston Avenue. What happened next was not coordinated by the demonstration's organisers. It emerged from the crowd itself, the way certain moments in history emerge, not from a plan, but from a collective decision made in real time by thousands of people who have, in some cases, been waiting their entire lives for a particular moment to arrive. A group moved toward the Colston statue. Someone had brought ropes. The ropes went around the neck of the bronze figure and around its body. People pulled. The statue resisted for a moment, and then came away from its plinth, fell forward onto the pavement, and was dragged through the streets it had overlooked for 125 years. Past the Georgian buildings whose facades expressed the wealth that Colston's trade had helped generate. Past the harbour that Bristol's slave-trading ships had once left from. At the water's edge, the statue was lifted and thrown in. The whole sequence from ropes to splash took approximately 4 minutes. The footage, shot on multiple phones from multiple angles and uploaded within minutes, was viewed tens of millions of times within 48 hours. It appeared on the front pages of newspapers in the United States, in Australia, in France, in Germany, in Brazil, Bristol, a city whose global name recognition had been modest for most people outside the English-speaking world, became the visual centre of an international conversation about historical memory, public commemoration, and the ongoing consequences of the slave trade. The reactions came immediately and from every direction. Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, called the toppling a criminal act. He acknowledged Colston's role in the slave trade, but argued that the appropriate response to contested historical commemorations was democratic process rather than direct action. Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, used the word thuggery. Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, said the statue should have come down a long time ago, though it should have been done through the right processes. In Bristol, reactions divided along lines that did not map neatly onto national political affiliations. Marvin Rees, Bristol's mayor and the first directly elected black mayor of a major European city, said he understood the emotion behind the act, did not condemn the people who had done it, but acknowledged that the rule of law mattered. His position satisfied almost nobody completely. It was probably the most honest available articulation of the genuine complexity of the moment. Much of Bristol's black community reacted with something witnesses described as relief. Not surprise, not triumph, exactly. The sense that something which should have happened decades ago had finally happened. Paul Stevenson, the man who had organised the Bristol bus boycott 57 years earlier and who was 80 years old in 2020, said it was a great day for Bristol. The statue lay on the bottom of Bristol Harbour for 4 days before being recovered by the City Council. The bronze figure was lifted from the water, loaded onto a vehicle, and taken to a council storage facility. The plinth remained empty. 4 people were subsequently identified from the footage as having been directly involved in the toppling. They were charged with criminal damage. Their names were Rhian Graham, Milo Ponsford, Jake Scouse, and Sage Willoughby. Their trial took place in January 2022 at Bristol Crown Court. The jury acquitted all 4. The not guilty verdicts were returned after a defence that argued, among other things, that the statue itself constituted a public nuisance. The jury, which had heard testimony about the history of the slave trade and the history of the failed negotiations over the statue, deliberated and found all 4 defendants not guilty. The Attorney General subsequently referred the case to the Court of Appeal, seeking clarification on the legal principles involved. The Court of Appeal's ruling in June 2022 confirmed that the jury had been correctly directed on the law and that the acquittals were legally sound. In the weeks and months following the toppling, Bristol's institutions moved with a speed on the Colston question that 22 years of negotiations had not produced. The Colston-named schools announced renamings. Colston's school became Cotham Gardens Primary School. Colston's girls' school was renamed Montpelier High School. The merchant venturers announced they were ending the Colston Day celebrations and reconsidering their institutional relationship with his legacy. The Bristol Museum retrieved the statue from council storage and put it on display in the Shed Museum on the harbour side. Lying on its side, with the ropes still around its neck and the marks from its journey through the streets, still visible on its bronze surface. Around it, the museum placed context. The history of the slave trade, the history of the failed negotiations, the footage of the toppling, the reactions it produced. Bristol Museums has confirmed this as a permanent installation. The display attracted large numbers of visitors and continued controversy. Some felt the statue should have been returned to its plinth with a contextualizing plaque. Some felt it should have been melted down. The arguments that had been conducted about the statue for 22 years did not end when it came down. They continued, in a different register, around the prone bronze figure in the museum. Meanwhile, the plinth on which the statue had stood for 125 years remained empty. Not entirely empty in the immediate aftermath. For one day, a sculpture appeared on the plinth, placed there without official permission. It depicted a black woman named Jen Reed, her fist raised in the posture of defiance. The sculpture was the work of the artist Mark Quinn. The council removed it after 24 hours, citing lack of authorization. The image of that unauthorized sculpture on the plinth where Colston had stood became one of the most reproduced photographs of the entire episode. Then, a public consultation began on the future of the plinth. Thousands of responses arrived. Proposals ranged from a permanent sculpture of a raised fist to a memorial to the enslaved people of the Atlantic trade, to leaving the plinth empty as a permanent statement about the difficulty of deciding who deserves to be commemorated. The consultation produced no quick consensus. And in that ongoing inability of a city to decide what should stand where Colston once stood, there is a truth about Bristol that is more honest than any bronze figure could express. This city has not resolved its history. It has only stopped pretending that it had. Chapter 13. What Bristol does next. The plinth is still empty. As of 2026, no permanent replacement for the Colston statue has been installed on the site on Colston Avenue. The consultation produced recommendations. Those recommendations entered further review. The plinth remains bare stone, open to the sky. This is not a simple failure of process. Though the process has been slow, it is a reflection of something genuine. Bristol is a city that does not agree with itself about what the last 400 years mean, about what is owed to whom, about what should be honored and what should be acknowledged. Those disagreements are real. They deserve to be taken seriously rather than resolved by administrative decision alone. Bristol, in 2026, is a city that functions. Its economy has shown resilience through the post-industrial period that many comparable British cities have not managed. With growth in aerospace, at Airbus in Filton, in technology companies clustered around its university campuses, and in creative industries whose output reaches well beyond the city's size. The University of Bristol and the University of the West of England together anchor a substantial research and education economy. Recent local authority estimates place the city's population in the region of 470,000, making it one of the larger cities in England outside London. The University of Bristol's own formal acknowledgement of the slave trade origins of its founding Wills Family Endowment, developed through institutional statements and research commitments in the early 2020s, represents a significant shift from the silence that characterized the university's public posture on that history for most of the 20th century. The creative culture that produced Massive Attack and Portishead and Banksy, the Bristol-raised street artist whose work addresses questions of power and historical memory with a directness that institutional processes rarely achieve, continues to give the city a cultural identity that extends well beyond its size. The harbour that Bristol's slave trading ships once left from is now a cultural and commercial district, the Watershed Cinema and Media Centre, the Arnolfini Arts Space, the restaurants and independent retailers that line the harbourside have transformed what was, within living memory, a working industrial port into one of the most visited parts of the city. The steamship Great Britain sits in her dry dock at the end of the harbour, drawing visitors from around the world to stand beside the iron hull that Brunel launched on a July morning in 1843. These are real achievements. Bristol is, by most measures, a city that works. And yet, the neighbourhood of St. Paul's, where Paul Stephenson organised his bus boycott in 1963, and where the uprising of 1980 expressed decades of accumulated grievance, remains among the more deprived urban areas in the southwest of England. Bristol City Council's own deprivation assessments consistently show that the wards containing St. Paul's and the adjacent neighbourhoods of Easton and Lawrence Hill rank among the most economically challenged in the city. The population of those neighbourhoods is disproportionately black and minority ethnic. The population of Clifton and the affluent western neighbourhoods is disproportionately white. Research published by the Bristol Race Equality Network in 2021 found persistent and substantial disparities in economic outcomes between white Bristol residents and black and minority ethnic residents. Disparities, the researchers concluded, reflected structural conditions operating across the city's economy and institutions rather than individual factors alone. Whether the commitments made by the City Council and the Mayor's Office in the years following 2020 have begun to change those structural conditions at the pace and scale the underlying problem requires, is a question the data from those neighbourhoods will answer more honestly than any official statement can. This is not a problem unique to Bristol. It exists in different forms in every city in the English-speaking world that carries a history of racial inequality operating across generations. What makes Bristol's version specific is the particular clarity of its origins. The wealth that built the city, that created the institutional landscape of schools and hospitals and civic buildings and commercial networks, was generated in significant part through the slave trade. The communities whose ancestors built that wealth are present in the city today. They live in St. Paul's and Easton and Lawrence Hill. Their children go to school in Bristol. Their grandchildren are Bristolians. The question of what Bristol owes to those communities is not primarily a question about statues. It is a question about housing policy and school funding and employment practices and the distribution of investment that flows through a prosperous city. It is a question about whether the reckoning that the events of June 2020 represented can be converted from a moment of symbolic public action into a sustained and practical commitment to changing the material conditions of people, whose lives are still shaped by the history that put Edward Colston on that plinth in the first place. Before we leave Bristol, there is one more thing worth saying about the statue itself. Now that it lies on its side in the M-shed with the ropes still around its neck, when you visit the museum and stand beside it, the thing that strikes most people is not its size, which is smaller than you expect, or the quality of the casting, which is competent but not exceptional. What strikes people is the expression on the bronze face. It is serene, confident, the face of a man who, in 1895, when the statue was made, had been commemorated by his city as one of its finest sons, and had every reason to expect that commemoration to be permanent. The serenity is what makes it strange now. Lying on its side with the harbour silt still faintly visible in its folds, a face that expected permanence, brought low by 4 minutes and a set of ropes, preserved under museum lighting, while the city above it argues about what comes next. The plinth is empty. The city is deciding. The Avon moves in and out with the tide, twice a day, as it has since before anyone gave it a name. Bristol endures. But enduring and reckoning are different things, and reckoning and changing are different things still. The story started with a river and a bridge and a decision to control a crossing. 400 years later, The city that grew from that decision is still standing at a crossing of a different kind. Which way it goes is not yet written.